Introduction to yarn. Always start with some basic terms and just the process that is involved into changing, for example, natural fibers into a yarn we'll look at, as well as the methods to create manufactured and synthetic yarns. So just to define yarn. Yarn can be defined as continuous strands of filaments, fibers, or other materials that are suitable for weaving on a loom, needle construction not done on a loom, and otherwise used intertwining or twisted to produce a textile. So even those nice filament, I have pretty long filament hair fibers, those can then be twisted either dry or wet and spun into a yarn. All textiles, yarns, like textile fibers, must be relatively long and thin to provide the flexibility required in manufacturing and use. So this is a question on your quiz. What is a monofilament? So mono meaning one, filament being a fiber, a long fiber, is actually manufactured by the fiber producer. In this process, a single filament is treated as a yarn structure. So on the quiz, I'm going to ask you an example of a monofilament will be like a fishing wire, right? That long single filament that is manufactured, it's made of a synthetic petroleum-based product, is extruded into that long single fiber. Monofilaments are often used in the production of lightweight, transparent window coverings. So let's just put that down let's make that point as an interior designer. It's often used for lightweight, transparent window coverings. So things like shears, right? Those shears. We learned early on that shears are not your typical 54-inch wide bolt, but rather more like 120 inches, so that those light shear panels can be constructed into panels and go across an entire window without a seam. So that single monofilament creates that very nice shear. It's strong, it's long, and then it's semi-transparent, so monofilaments. Monofilaments are also used as a strong sewing thread in the construction of many textiles. So we don't have this example in our swatches today, but if you were to order a swatch, let's say from Kravet or Pindler or Knoll, the edge of the fabric might be finished with a serged or finished edge. And typically that yarn, if you pull it out, will be one of these monofilaments, that kind of plasticky single yarn. So we move from mono, a single, to multifilament. Multifilament yarn, simple yarn composed of several filaments. So swatch 29, that is an example of a multifilament yarn. So whether you pull those yarns off the top, so I'm doing that right now. So go ahead and take some of those yarns, pull it off the top, maybe pull it off the side. And you can see that they have multifilaments twisted together. So a little bit about how you can determine if this is like a spun yarn or this multi-filament yarn. First, I want you to do is look at the fiber content. So the fiber content is polyester. Polyester is a synthetic fiber, meaning that it was extruded, right? So it first had its dope and it was in its liquid state, and then it was extruded into this long, that's important, long fiber. and then it was twisted together. So it makes a very fine yarn. It makes a very smooth yarn, and it makes a very luxurious textile. So when you feel sample 29, you can see that it feels almost like silk. So recalling that silk is long and has a nice luster as well. So this is polyester, and it should feel very silky like. And so that kind of gives you the clue of what yarn you're looking at. How does the end fabric feel? And this was yarn dyed, so that means that polyester dope probably had the color placed right in it, okay, to create those colors. So multi-filament. So my two that are on there, I pulled out some of those warp yarns, and you can almost just pull apart the very small, fine, individual monofilaments. You can see how it was twisted together in a yarn. Very, very fine. So like fibers, yarn is important to interior textiles as it can establish the formality or informality of a fabric, from smooth to coarse, compact to loft, simple to complex. We just looked at one of the two basic divisions of yarn, the filament, and we'll also look next at spun. So sample 30 is swatch number 30 is an example of spun yarns. Short staple fibers must be twisted or spun to make yarn. So those fibers aren't long. So unlike silk, unlike long polyester synthetic fibers, they're short. So they come off of an animal or a plant. And those short little fibers need to be spun to make yarns. Originally, fibers were spun using this drop spinning weight, this drop weight, and gravity to spin the yarn. So someone would, like the Egyptian, would just spin it using gravity. And then we moved to like Sleeping Beauty, the spinning wheel, where we used the foot to help spin the fibers into a yarn, and today being moved into production. Spun yarns are derived from all natural fibers except silk, and note, from manufactured fibers cut into staple lengths. So I've talked several times about how manufactured fibers are moving more and more into a direction that they look like natural fibers. So they're being cut and crimped and textured into these small staple lengths so that when they're spun into a yarn, they really resemble the real thing. So let's look at swatch number 30. So try to pull out those weft yarns from the bottom or the top. And this is a spun yarn example. So a couple of clues that you should look for. First of all, it's made of cotton. I've already told you, so when you do your activity 5.1, if it's a natural fiber, it's spun, right? So cotton is spun. And you can also feel that there's more of that texture, and it's less fine than example 29. I mean, sample 29, the individual fibers are like thinner, smaller and thinner, and the density of, I mean, it's definitely smaller than an eyelash. It's just so very, very fine. So next, feel the texture of the swatch number 30. It's heavier. It has less luster. than sample 29. But our biggest clue is that it's cotton, which is spun. So different than spun yarns are these filament yarns, again, that we look at in number 29. That would be your silk, that would be your synthetics that are twisted into smooth, lustrous, uniform, strong yarns. So the next couple of slides just go through the process. The textbook doesn't go through the process as much, but so just kind of quickly, I'm not going to spend too much time on the process, but just looking at natural yarns. So there are in nature some filament yarns. We talked about silk and also horsehair. But we're going to talk today about the shorter staple yarns such as wool, cotton, and linen. So here's just an example of the cotton being cleaned and graded. This is the picker lap that was created. And then just a quick example of the process. Carded cotton is drawn into separate slivers that look like those ponytails. The slivers are combined into one sliver via a second drawing passage coming down here. Converted and twisted into a rove. So we'll see examples of these kind of very loose roving yarns. Yarn is manufactured and used, taken, carded, straightened, put into a sliver, and then made into a yarn. Here is an example like grayish goods, just natural spun yarn. It hasn't been dyed yet. Here's an example of the process to spin linen. Not going to spend so much time, but those come in those really long stalks of the plant, if you remember that, these very long stalks of the plant. So they need to be dried, retted, or slightly decomposed so that that outer stem can be broken and all the fine fibers can be pulled out. It is then carded and combed, put into those bunches, and typically wet spun or dry spun. And just look the difference between wet spinning and dry spinning for linen. When they take those long fibers, those slivers, and they wet spin it, it's going to produce a smoother yarn. Versus if those same linens that are dry spun, they're going to make a loftier or bulkier yarn. And I'll just ask those of you who are here if you can kind of have this little experiment. Next time you get out of the shower, try just kind of twisting your hair fibers. Just try twisting your hair fibers. When it's wet, it actually, and you spin it, it actually kind of stays, all those little small short fibers, the short staple fibers, kind of just nice stay into a shape. And so it creates a smoother yarn. And then you can even just do it right now like I'm trying to do. You can do it while it's dry and all those nice little short grays start popping out. So just a little example just to kind of feel the difference between wet spinning and dry spinning. So even after something is wet spun and it dries, it tends to stay in that shape. Here's an example of silk being spun. And just as a reminder, wild silk cocoons, those harvested out in nature, those cocoons of that animal or that insect is allowed to break open the cocoon and fly away. So when that cocoon is broken, it produces short, staple silk fibers, rather than cultivated silk, who drops those little cocoons in the vat of boiling water and then harvests the silk fiber that creates those long ones. So there's just really a difference in what those look like. And I do want you to kind of, I know you've already been tested on this, but just to kind of keep in mind the difference between woolen and worsted spinning methods. So again, that woolen method produces a short, staple, bulky loft and fuzzy yarn. So when you want those big, heavy, warm, insulated sweaters and scarves, the yarn comes from the woolen method. Versus the worsted method is tightly twisted, longer staple, producing a smoother, stronger, typical, finer yarn. And we bring this to your attention because wool is a sustainable resource, but wool is not often used in interiors as it used to be. So the synthetic market kind of has overshadowed a little bit of the wool market. So I just kind of again bring this to your attention that you can start thinking about the possibilities of specifying wool and even in commercial interiors. Here's an example of that, almost that looks like the fishing wire, that manufactured long continuous monofilament. And again, scientists today have learned to manipulate that long manufactured single monofilament, cutting it into short staple fibers, crimping it, and having all kinds of fun things to make it look like that natural texture. So you're going to come across in your text and then in your quiz, what is a slub yarn? So in nature, this idea of slubbing, where a yarn gradually shifts from thin to thinner over long lengths, does occur in nature. So you're looking at Dupioni silk here that has all these nice slubs and nubs in it. And moving from thin, it gives that nice texture. That happens naturally. And also scientists are able to manipulate synthetic yarns and kind of make that same effect of slubbing available in synthetic fibers and yarns. So playing around with that. So an example is swatch number 35. So swatch number 35, it's what's called a tweed. And that kind of heathered, multicolored effect, that comes with how it was dyed. But that tweeded texture, those little slubs and nubs, come from the yarn. So swatch 35 is made of wool, natural fiber. It's therefore spun. And in that spinning process, those little slubs, the variation of natural hair going from thick to thinner, I could look at my own hair and see a little bit of that. That happens, and those little bit of nubs or knobs or bumps happen naturally. So when it's twisted into a yarn, you not only have the coloration from the dyeing process, but you have that really nice texture. So that's an example of a natural spun wool that has slub yarns. So I've used the term nubs quite a bit. Nubs are similar to tiny little knots that feel as if they can be picked off the surface of the fabric, but they are actually spun in the yarn to create a rough texture. So rough texture. So something else I would like you to really kind of keep in your vault as an interior designer. When something has more nubs or a rough surface, it typically tilts a little more rustic, a little less formal, a little less luster, so it kind of tips in that more informal direction. So I'm saying this over and over again, where something that's long with the filaments gets that nice luster, that sheen, and goes more formal. So as you work with me throughout other classes, Bobby, you already are, I really try to help students kind of establish the formality of their projects for their clients. So here are examples of how monofilaments can become texturized. So anything that once looked like a fishing wire can be crimped. It could be twisted. It could be coiled. It could be add curl. It could add bulk. So anything that once looked like a single monofilament fishing wire can be engineered with slubs and nubs and all of these different effects. It can then be cut into short fibers. And this is why, students, that these manufactured synthetic fibers are looking so close to the original. Here's just a different definition of what a thread is. I don't think that this is on the exam, but a thread is a very fine yarn to hold fabrics together. Clear monofilament threads are extruded and not spun, and those are the ones that look like thin fishing line. So a thread, a needle and thread. In your readings, you read about how the different spinning of fibers and twisting them together actually makes a fiber sturdier. So I'm going to have you do, if you have long enough hair, to think about hair again. And think about what happens when you, even in wet spinning, if you twist your hair together, either left or right, left-handed twist is a Z, right-handed twist is an S, and you let it you let it just kind of sit there. Well, it stays fairly well, but it also can come undone. Now think about braiding your hair. So if you braid your hair, that braid is much stronger. So this is going to be the same principles that are applied to twists of yarn. So typically in a construction of a fabric, weft yarns, those are the ones that run horizontally, have a left twist. And the warp yarns that run up the vertical are right twists. And so what happens when those two are then woven together, the fabric is sturdier. So I think that's very clear and straightforward, but someone's very way back when kind of came up with this. There's a term called turn per inch. So much of the variety and control in yarn production comes from the number of turns per inch. So these turns per inch are very loose, right? Very loose, very bulky. So thinking about kind of how many turns of that yarn are in per inch will reflect how fine it will be. So tightly spun yarns may have as many as 30 to 40 turns per inch, making them strong, durable, and very fine to the hand. That makes sense. Loose spun yarn, like our hair example, have a more textural effect and may have as few as 2 to 3 turns per inch. Yarns that are very loosely twisted are called slack or slack twisted yarns. Yarns which are so tightly twisted can curl back on themselves are called crepe twisted yarns. So a little bit about single to complex yarns and how many plies there are. So thinking about toilet paper, we can think about how many plies or how many layers are in that toilet paper that we buy. You know, the more plies, maybe kind of the more comfort. So we're going to also talk about plies as it relates to yarns. So we move from a single yarn to ply yarns. Swatch 31 in your book is an example of a 2-ply spun yarn. So try to grab from the bottom or the top and grab some yarn. That's what I'm doing. So first of all, it's spun. So I'm going through these very carefully because this will help you do your activity. First of all, it's spun. It's made of cotton. And I just pulled out two black yarns from the bottom. And I could almost untwist those really easily and find 2 plies. So if I kind of untwist it or play around with a little bit, you'll see that it's 2 plies of yarn. Somewhere, oh, there, I got them. I pulled them apart.
Oh, and Corey, I have a question. This is Bobby.
Hi, Bobby.
Hi. So on this swatch, I'm pulling off the bottom, and am I looking to get the shorter fibers?
Mine are short. I would say mine are like 2 inches, and they're black.
Okay.
Because we want to make sure that we're getting, the textbook uses the weft yarns in the exercise. So I pulled out kind of the black, I'm going to call them chenille. So I guess it depends on where your sample is cut. I was able to pull out the black yarns that are very fuzzy. So those are the weft yarns or the fill yarns. And I was able to just quickly pull them apart into 2 yarns. Cable yarns are made up of 2 or more ply yarns. So that would mean that if we had 2 of these black yarns together and then they were plied together, that would be a cable yarn. And in the example, I just chose examples that are 2 different colors. So for students who are watching the recording, they don't have to be different colors. They can be, but they don't have to be. So in our example on number 31, it's 2 black yarns that were spun together. And here in this cable yarn, I made it 2 different colors too, so you can see the yellow and kind of the purple ply yarns that had been spun together. This term isn't in your textbook, but I would like you to know what a marl yarn is. A marl yarn is when 2 yarns of the same size, it's a 2-ply, but of 2 colors are plied together, creating a barber pole effect. So for those students who aren't kind of familiar with the term barber pole, outside of barber stands was a bright red and white pole that would twist around red and white, and so that's why it's called like a barber pole effect. I should add that to the lecture. So roving yarns are heavy yarns that are twisted very slowly and loosely together. So there you have a roving yarn. So I can only think of one interior application of where I've seen roving yarns, maybe 2 applications. And that would be in Phoenix, Arizona, or maybe there is some type of like spirit catcher or mood catcher where there's something that looks like a spider web in Native American culture, and these very loose woven yarns are kind of spun like a spider web around that. I've seen those. I've seen them maybe loosely in some decorative wall hangings. So roving yarns, more popular in the 70s, but the 70s decor is really coming back into popularity. So maybe we'll be seeing more of these roving yarns, but mostly used in decorative items. So looking at some of these different cords, so we're going to get into some of the different trim pieces. So cords and trims as we move into needle construction. And those trims, like a trim around, a decorative trim around a pillow or bullion fringe hanging from a drapery, is a core yarn, is a yarn that is twisted around a core. So yarns that are twisted around a core, and they create these different effects. So they start with a core, and then the yarn goes around it, and you're able to create different effects. So not just cords and braids and trims, but actual different effects with yarns. So we'll take a look at a different one of these. So a routine yarn are yarns that are tightly curled and textured and plied. And here's what you need to know. So there's a core, and then the yarns are plied in a zigzag or rickety rack pattern across the core. So there's a core that runs down the middle of this, and then the yarns are plied in this kind of twisty zigzag rick-rack direction. And so Bobby and Linda, you can imagine that if this was then spun into a yarn and then woven into a textile, that textile is going to have a lot of that kind of textured quality as well. And it's similar to, but a little different than what's called a boucle yarn. So a boucle yarn are two or more effect yarns that are very tightly twisted to create, and I have it underlined, a kinky, curly effect. This is sometimes used in heavy upholstery. In the 1950s, like collars on dresses and collars on jackets, it was called a poodle cloth. But in interior design, we often refer to it as a boucle cloth. So looking at swatch number 32. So I have a little Maltipoo, right? So poodles have that curly, you can see why it's called a poodle cloth. So this is actually made of acrylic. So this makes it a little harder. But we also know that the original boucles were made of wool. So this is made of acrylic, cut to resemble wool, spun into a yarn with this boucle effect, creating that kinky, curly effect. So the yarns, it really is the yarns that make this textile look like a little curly poodle. Boucle fabric on the left, poodle cloth on the right. So this is more what we'll get to a little later, but here you can see gimp yarns. When one yarn is spiraled tightly, a yarn or braid is braided 3 or more times around one core, and the cord is entirely covered. So you get this nice braid. So we'll get to this a little more, but for those of you who are listening and are ready to be interior designers, a cord versus a cord with lip. So you need one of these braids or cords with a lip if you want to attach it to, let's say, a pillow, around the rim of a pillow, or to the edge of an upholstery piece. It needs this lip. Otherwise, it's just a braid or cord that will wrap around something. So that's what the lip is right there. Side note. Chenille notes are in examples. Chenille yarns are in example swatch 33 and 34. Neither of these are great interior examples of chenille yarns. So let me first define it, and I think most of you know where you find chenille yarns and fabrics. You could probably just tell me right now. Chenille yarns are made by lino weaving a thick, fuzzy fabric. So that's the key, fuzzy fabric with thick spaced warp yarns and fine weft threads. The fabric is cut into length-wide strips and fine weft threads to create a pipe cleaner or fuzzy caterpillar look. So yes, those look like a fuzzy caterpillar yarn or pipe cleaner yarn. So there they are. So better is the example 34. If you pull from the top or the bottom, I just pulled out a black yarn on number 34, swatch number 34, and one came out that really just looks like a black caterpillar. And then if you feel swatch number 33, you can feel how fuzzy that yarn is. You can feel how fuzzy that yarn is because it's a chenille yarn. So look at the description of yarn construction on number 33. Yarn construction. First of all, this is polyester. The warp yarns, the ones that go across, the ones that go up and down, you have to help me with that. The ones that go up and down are the filament yarns. They are very, very fine. And then the weft yarns that are woven through are those fuzzy chenille. Were you able to pull a sample of something kind of fuzzy that looks like a little pipe cleaner? I need to add a slide here. Chenille fabrics are used across the board in interior design as what, if you want to guess? Because they're nice and soft and textured. If they're polyester cotton blend, they're soft, durable.
Do they use them the first thing that pops into my mind is a bedspread.
Yes, and that's my next picture, that for decorative, fun purposes. And so I had a former student who works now at Bassett. She said 80% of sofas that people purchased are chenille. These chenille fabrics, because they're soft, they're durable, they hide the dirt. So all that nice kind of natural colored, soft upholstery comes from these chenille yarns. So that was really, I was glad that she told me that. She's like, yeah, you can show them something different, but they want chenille. This is what I'm showing you. This is exaggerated chenille. So you're right. So that those chenille yarns were used, Bobby, to create those wonderful, 1950s and 1960s bedspreads. And then today we see chenille really cute used in children's bedding in model homes. I would just go down to Joann's and purchase these, for $10 a yard, some of this chenille fabric, and I would incorporate it into like nurseries and kids' bedding. Really cute and fun. But for the most part, chenille sofas. That's the end of the lecture.